So welcome back to another episode of the Israel Issue, where today we're thinking about the last but one constituent of the sap which issues out of those gifts that God uniquely placed into the roots of Israel to enable Israel to be the people he'd called them to be and to do what he'd called them to do. And that gift we're thinking about today is God's blessing of Israel with his promises. Now, hopefully you've already got the feel for how, as the Jewish Messiah, Yeshua made each of these gifts his own. He then redeemed them in order to be able to give them back to every Jewish believer who'd receive him as their Messiah, so that they could fulfill their distinctive calling as one of God's chosen people. And then also to we who are Gentiles that are grafted into Israel, that we may contribute to Israel's calling to be a light to the Gentiles. Now, the role of the promises of God to Israel came very specifically through the direct outcomes that God promised to Israel because of his special, we might say, his unique relationship with them. And they began with the promises that God made to Abraham, first materially, that he'd be the father of many nations and that kings would descend from him. Also that his descendants would inherit a land that stretched from the Nile to the Euphrates rivers, and then spiritually that through him all the nations of the earth would be blessed. And after this came around 100 or more promises that God gave to Israel regarding the future of the nation as a whole, and then an almost uncountable number of promises about what would happen to Israel as individuals if they obeyed God's Torah, or alternatively, if they disobeyed it. So Israel was a nation of God's promise like no other nation on earth. And as David observed the outworking of God's promises given to the nation as a whole and then to the Israelites individually, this was what he commented. The Lord is faithful to all his promises and righteous in all his ways. So David had appreciated in the overview the reason why God gave the promises that he did to Israel, both as a nation and as individuals. And it was about much, much more than them just having their immediate needs fulfilled. Through the experience of the way that God really did fulfill his promises, providing Israel recognized the conditions for them, they then had an experience, an opportunity like no other nation had, to understand the very nature of his righteousness. As they experienced that, as they came to understand what it meant to be in the flow of God's righteousness, then they understood what it was to have a living relationship with the God of Israel through his promises. And this is what Paul had also recognized, which is why he placed the gift of God's promises into the roots of Israel, recognizing the blessing that they brought to Israel. But he had seen something more than this. He had seen the way that Yeshua then redeemed the way that Israel had lost the grip on the promises that God had given by the way that Yeshua had then become a servant of the Jews on behalf of God's truth to confirm the promises made to the patriarchs. So Paul had seen how Yeshua, in taking human form, had fulfilled literally hundreds of the promises God had made about the coming of the Messiah, both directly and indirectly, to such an extent that he was then able to say, for no matter how many promises God has made, they are yes in the Messiah. And that's despite the fact that Yeshua did not actually fulfill all the promises made about the coming of the Messiah. That's because he is coming back again. But here was Paul's point. There were so many of the promises that Yeshua had fulfilled, and these included those to do with the place of his birth, the circumstances of his birth, and also what happened to him in his death, both as he died and after he died, which was so impossible for anyone to fulfill. The odds of doing so were remote beyond calculation. Because of this, we can be certain that by the time Yeshua comes again, all the other promises, both made about him as the coming Messiah and also about Israel, will be fulfilled. And this is why Paul then continued, and so through him the Amen is spoken by us to the glory of God. But this is where it's so crucial for we who are Gentiles to remember that we only can draw from the promises of God because we are grafted into Israel. The promises of God were made to Israel, not direct to the Gentiles. Now, those who hold to replacement theology, this view that the church has replaced Israel in God's purposes, think that you can get the promises of God direct from him. But we only get them through being grafted into Israel and being able to draw up that sap, that nourishment from the roots of Israel that Yeshua redeemed. And that's why so much of today's Gentile church only sort of experiences the promises of God, but not the fullness of them. But can you imagine what it will be like when Jewish and Gentile believers come together in one body with a proper understanding that we are members together of one body and sharers together in the promise in Yeshua, the Messiah? And especially given these words from Hebrews, the covenant of which he, Yeshua, is mediator, is superior to the old one, since the new covenant is established on better promises. Now, if the new covenant offers better promises to Israel, and we as Gentiles may be grafted into this, then how much really could be issuing forth in our lives if we truly drew from what the promises of God are actually rooted in? Now, if you'd like to think more about drawing strength from the promises of God, then do go to our website, www.lethelionroar.com. Go to the Israel Issue tab, and there you'll find a short study to go with today's episode. You'll also find previous studies and episodes that you might also like to refer back to. If you're watching for the first time, do hit that subscribe button so that you'll receive this direct in the future, and also do tell others about this most important of messages. And I look forward to being back with you in the not too distant future with another episode of the Israel Issue.
Audio Jungle.